In the scorching summer of 1891, the dusty streets of Perdition Creek, Texas, bore witness to an event that would haunt the American folklore for generations. Sheriff Marcus Whitmore, a man whose reputation preceded him like thunder before lightning, became the center of a tale so extraordinary that even the most seasoned storytellers struggle to separate fact from fiction. The town of Perdition Creek sat like a forgotten prayer on the edge of civilization, where the law was as fragile as morning frost, and justice came at the barrel of a gun. Sheriff Whitmore had maintained order in this godforsaken place for nearly a decade, his steady hand and unwavering resolve earning him respect from honest folk and fear from those who walked crooked paths through life. What makes this story particularly compelling to students of Western horror and dark American folklore is the meticulous documentation that survived. The town's physician, Dr. Eleanor Blackwood, kept detailed medical records that would later serve as crucial evidence. Her journal entries, discovered in 1924, provide a scientific perspective on events that seem to defy all natural explanation and human understanding. The psychological impact of frontier life on law enforcement officers has been extensively studied by modern historians. The isolation, constant threat of violence, and weight of responsibility created unique pressures that could break even the strongest minds. Sheriff Whitmore, however, had always appeared immune to these stresses, maintaining his duties with mechanical precision and unshakable determination throughout his career. If you're fascinated by true horror stories rooted in American history, you'll want to hear every detail of what transpired in those 3 impossible days. The events that began on July the 15th, 1891, would challenge everything the townspeople believed about life, death, and the thin boundary that separates the 2 realms of human existence. Perdition Creek earned its ominous name from the blood-red creek that ran through its center, stained by iron ore deposits that gave the water an unsettling crimson hue. The town existed primarily to serve the nearby silver mines, attracting prospectors, gamblers, and the kind of desperate souls who gravitated toward places where civilization wore thin and moral boundaries blurred into gray uncertainty. By 1891, the population had swelled to nearly 800 residents, making it large enough to require serious law enforcement, but small enough that everyone knew their neighbor's business. The wooden buildings lined the main street like crooked teeth, their weathered facades bearing witness to countless storms, both meteorological and human, that had swept through this corner of Texas over the years. Sheriff Whitmore had arrived in Perdition Creek in 1882, a young man seeking to make his mark on a lawless frontier. His background remained largely mysterious, though townspeople whispered he'd been a cavalry officer during the final conflicts with native tribes. What mattered more than his past was his present effectiveness, his ability to maintain peace in a place where violence lurked beneath every poker game and business transaction. The historical significance of towns like Perdition Creek cannot be understated in understanding the development of American law enforcement. These frontier communities served as testing grounds for legal systems, social contracts, and the delicate balance between individual freedom and collective safety. They were laboratories of human behavior under extreme conditions, where civilization's veneer could crack with frightening ease. Doctor. Blackwood's records indicate that Whitmore had never missed a day of duty, never shown signs of the mental strain that claimed so many of his profession. Yet something was building beneath that composed exterior, something that would soon manifest in ways that defied medical science and challenged the very foundations of what the townspeople believed possible in their harsh but predictable world. The role of a frontier sheriff demanded more than just skill with firearms and the courage to face dangerous criminals. Marcus Whitmore served as judge, jury, and executioner in situations where formal courts were hundreds of miles away, and justice couldn't wait for legal proceedings. This burden had shaped him into a man of few words but decisive action, someone who carried the weight of life and death decisions with stoic determination. His daily routine had become as predictable as sunrise and sunset. Each morning at precisely 6 o'clock, Whitmore would emerge from his modest quarters behind the jail, check on any prisoners, and begin his patrol of the town's streets and establishments. His presence alone was often enough to prevent trouble, as his reputation for swift and impartial justice had spread throughout the territory like wildfire. The psychological profile of frontier lawmen reveals fascinating insights into human resilience and breaking points. Modern studies of historical horror and dark Western folklore often focus on how isolation and responsibility affected these men's mental states. Whitmore appeared to have found a sustainable balance, channeling the darkness of his profession into an almost mechanical efficiency that served his community well. Dr. Blackwood's medical observations noted that Whitmore rarely spoke of his past or expressed personal opinions about the criminals he apprehended. He treated his duties with the solemnity of a religious calling, viewing himself as an instrument of justice rather than a man passing judgment on his fellow humans. This detachment, while professionally effective, may have created internal pressures that built slowly over time. The townspeople had grown so accustomed to Whitmore's steady presence that they rarely considered what might happen if something disrupted his carefully maintained routine. They couldn't imagine their stalwart sheriff facing a situation that his training and experience couldn't handle, a challenge that would push him beyond the boundaries of what any human being should be expected to endure. July 1891 brought an oppressive heat that seemed to press down on Perdition Creek like a giant's hand, making tempers short and patience scarce among the town's residents. The mercury thermometer at Dr. Blackwood's clinic registered temperatures above 100 degrees for 12 consecutive days, creating conditions that strained both human endurance and social fabric to their absolute breaking points. The silver mines had been producing less ore each month, creating economic tensions that rippled through every business and household in town. Desperate men make desperate choices, and Sheriff Whitmore found himself dealing with an increasing number of thefts, fights, and confidence schemes as people struggled to maintain their livelihoods in an increasingly uncertain environment. 3 separate gangs of outlaws had been reported operating in the surrounding territory, each group bolder than the last in their raids on supply wagons and isolated homesteads. The territorial governor had requested that local sheriffs coordinate their efforts, but communication between towns remained sporadic and unreliable, leaving each community largely dependent on its own resources for protection and law enforcement. American folklore is rich with tales of supernatural occurrences during times of extreme stress and environmental pressure. A combination of economic hardship, physical discomfort, and social tension creates conditions where the human psyche becomes more susceptible to experiences that challenge rational explanation. Perdition Creek in July 1891 was a powder keg waiting for the right spark. Dr. Blackwood's journal entries from this period reveal her growing concern about the community's mental health. She noted an increase in patients complaining of nightmares, insomnia, and a general sense of impending doom that seemed to hang over the town like storm clouds. Even the most level-headed residents spoke of feeling watched by unseen eyes and hearing whispers in the desert wind. Dr. Eleanor Blackwood stood as an anomaly in Perdition Creek, one of the few female physicians practicing on the frontier, and certainly the only one with formal medical training from an Eastern university. Her scientific background and keen observational skills made her uniquely qualified to document the extraordinary events that would soon unfold, though even her training couldn't prepare her for what she would witness. Her medical practice served the entire community, from delivering babies to treating gunshot wounds, giving her intimate knowledge of nearly every resident's physical and mental condition. She had developed a particular interest in the psychological effects of frontier life, corresponding with colleagues in Boston and New York about her observations of how extreme conditions affected human behavior and perception. In the weeks leading up to the incident, Dr. Blackwood had noticed subtle changes in Sheriff Whitmore's demeanor during his routine visits to check on prisoners receiving medical attention. His usual calm composure seemed more forced, his responses more clipped than usual. Most telling were the dark circles under his eyes, suggesting sleep disturbances that he was careful not to discuss. The historical significance of having a trained medical observer present during such events cannot be overstated. Dr. Blackwood's documentation provides crucial scientific perspective on what might otherwise be dismissed as mere frontier superstition or embellished storytelling. Her commitment to factual recording, even when the facts seem to challenge medical understanding, gives credibility to accounts that might seem impossible. Her journal entry from July 14, 1891, the day before the incident, reads, "Sheriff Whitmore appears to be suffering from what my colleagues would term nervous exhaustion, though he refuses to acknowledge any distress. There is something in his eyes, a distance that suggests he is seeing things beyond our immediate reality. I fear a crisis approaches." Dawn broke over Perdition Creek with an unusual stillness that several residents would later remember with unsettling clarity. The constant desert wind that typically stirred the dust and tumbleweeds had fallen completely silent, leaving the air heavy and expectant. Even the town's dogs seemed subdued, staying close to their owners rather than roaming freely through the streets. Sheriff Whitmore began his morning routine at precisely 6 o'clock, just as he had every day for nearly a decade. Mrs. Patterson, who ran the boarding house across from the jail, watched from her kitchen window as he emerged from his quarters. She later told Dr. Blackwood that something about his movements seemed different, more deliberate, as if he were performing each action for the last time. The first sign of trouble came at approximately 7:30, when young Tommy Henderson burst into the general store, breathless with excitement and terror. He'd been playing near the old mine shaft on the outskirts of town when he spotted riders approaching from the south, at least 8 men moving with the purposeful coordination of experienced outlaws rather than honest travelers. Historical records indicate that the Castellanos gang had been terrorizing communities throughout South Texas for months, their leader, Diego Castellanos, having escaped from a prison transport 6 months earlier. They were known for their brutal efficiency and their leader's particular hatred of law enforcement officers, whom he blamed for the death of his brother during a previous arrest. Sheriff Whitmore received the news with characteristic calm, though Dr. Blackwood, who happened to be in the general store purchasing supplies, noticed that his hands trembled almost imperceptibly as he checked his weapons. For a man whose steady nerves had become legendary throughout the territory, this slight show of human vulnerability seemed both startling and somehow prophetic of the extraordinary events about to unfold. Diego Castellanos had earned his fearsome reputation through a combination of tactical brilliance and ruthless violence that made him one of the most wanted men in Texas. His gang specialized in targeting isolated communities where law enforcement was minimal, striking fast, and disappearing into the vast desert landscape before organized pursuit could be mounted. Their approach to Perdition Creek suggested this would be their most ambitious raid yet. The gang's modus operandi involved creating maximum psychological impact through displays of extreme violence against authority figures. They had previously killed 3 sheriffs in other towns, each death more brutal than the last, sending a clear message that resistance would be met with savage retribution. Their reputation preceded them like a plague, causing some lawmen to abandon their posts rather than face certain death. Sheriff Whitmore's response to the approaching threat revealed both his courage and perhaps the first hint of the psychological strain that would soon manifest in impossible ways. Rather than sending for help from neighboring communities or attempting to organize a citizens' militia, he methodically prepared for a confrontation that any rational assessment would deem suicidal for a single man against 8 experienced killers. The psychology of such decisions has fascinated researchers studying Western horror and frontier mentality. The concept of duty overriding self-preservation instincts appears repeatedly in accounts of lawmen who faced impossible odds. Some historians suggest these men entered altered mental states that allowed them to transcend normal human limitations, though the mechanisms behind such transformations remain mysterious. Dr. Blackwood's medical training led her to recognize signs of what modern psychology might classify as dissociative behavior. Whitmore's extreme calm in the face of certain death, his mechanical preparation for battle, and his apparent disconnection from emotional responses suggested his mind was protecting itself by creating psychological distance from the reality of his situation. Little did she know this was only the beginning of his separation from normal human experience. The town's residents began securing their families and possessions as word of the approaching gang spread through Perdition Creek like wildfire. Most of the men had minimal experience with firearms beyond hunting, and none possessed the training necessary to stand against professional outlaws. Their only hope lay with Sheriff Whitmore, a single man preparing to face odds that would challenge an entire cavalry unit. Whitmore's preparations took on an almost ritualistic quality that several witnesses later described with disturbing consistency. He cleaned and loaded his weapons with mechanical precision, checked his ammunition supply 3 times, and arranged his badge and papers on his desk as if preparing for an inspection rather than a gunfight. His movements suggested someone following a predetermined script rather than making tactical decisions. The historical context of such confrontations reveals the profound isolation experienced by frontier law enforcement. Unlike modern police officers who can call for backup and support, these men often face life-threatening situations with only their personal skills and weapons. The psychological pressure of such responsibility, accumulated over years of service, could create mental states that bordered on the supernatural. Dr. Blackwood attempted to convince several townsmen to assist the sheriff, but fear of the Castellanos gang's reputation proved stronger than civic duty. She later wrote that watching grown men cower while a single peace officer prepared to sacrifice himself for their protection revealed the darker aspects of human nature that frontier life often exposed. At approximately 10 o'clock, Whitmore made his final rounds of the town, speaking briefly with key residents and giving what appeared to be farewell instructions. His demeanor remained calm and professional, but several people noted that his eyes held a strange distance, as if he were already seeing beyond the immediate reality of his situation into some other realm of existence entirely. The Castellanos gang entered Perdition Creek at high noon, their timing calculated for maximum dramatic impact and tactical advantage. The brutal sun directly overhead eliminated shadows that might provide concealment, while the heat had driven most residents indoors, giving the outlaws clear control of the town's main street. Their confident formation suggested men who had performed this deadly dance many times before. Diego Castellanos himself rode at the front, a man whose reputation for cruelty was matched only by his tactical intelligence. His scarred face and cold eyes had become symbols of terror throughout South Texas, and his presence in Perdition Creek meant that this confrontation would end in blood. He had come specifically for Sheriff Whitmore, having heard of the lawman's reputation and wanting to add another peace officer's death to his collection. Sheriff Whitmore emerged from his office exactly at noon, stepping into the dusty street with the same measured pace he used for routine patrols. The contrast between one man and 8 mounted outlaws would have been comical, if not for the deadly seriousness of the situation. Yet something in Whitmore's bearing suggested he viewed the odds as irrelevant to the outcome he intended to achieve. The psychological dynamics of such confrontations involve complex interactions between fear, duty, and what some researchers term heroic dissociation. In extreme situations, individuals sometimes access mental states that allow them to function beyond normal human limitations. Sheriff Whitmore appeared to be entering such a state as he walked toward his appointment with destiny. Doctor, Blackwood watched from her clinic window, medical bag in hand and surgical instruments prepared for the inevitable casualties. She later wrote that Whitmore moved like a man already dead, his steps carrying the finality of someone who had made peace with his fate. None of the witnesses could have imagined that death itself was about to become irrelevant to the strange tale unfolding in their dusty street. The confrontation began with Diego Castellanos' traditional taunt, a challenge designed to humiliate the local lawman before killing him. His words echoed through the empty street, mocking Whitmore's solitude and promising a slow death for anyone foolish enough to oppose the gang's will. The outlaw leader had perfected this psychological warfare over years of terrorizing frontier communities. Sheriff Whitmore's response came not in words, but in action, his hand moving to his weapon with fluid precision that surprised even the experienced gunfighters facing him. The first shot rang out at 12:03 p.m., according to Dr. Blackwood's precise timepiece, beginning a sequence of events that would challenge everything the witnesses thought they knew about life and death. The gunfight itself lasted less than 2 minutes, but those 120 seconds contained enough violence and impossibility to fuel decades of ghost stories in Western folklore. Whitmore moved through the hail of bullets with an almost supernatural grace, his own shots finding their marks with deadly accuracy, while enemy fire seemed to pass harmlessly around him, like he existed in a different dimension. What happened next defies rational explanation and entered the realm of true historical horror. A bullet from Castellanos' own pistol struck Whitmore directly in the chest, the impact visible to multiple witnesses who watched the sheriff stagger backward from the force. Yet instead of falling, Whitmore steadied himself and continued fighting with the same mechanical precision he had shown throughout the encounter. The second shot, fired by gang member Carlos Santos, caught Whitmore in the shoulder, spinning him partially around but failing to drop him. Dr. Blackwood, watching from her window with medical training that had taught her to assess injuries accurately, later swore that both wounds should have been immediately incapacitating. Yet the sheriff fought on as if his body no longer responded to physical damage in any normal way. The third and most devastating shot came from Diego Castellanos himself, fired in desperation as he watched his men fall one by one to Whitmore's impossibly accurate return fire. The bullet struck the sheriff directly in the head, the impact audible to witnesses as a wet, final sound that should have ended any human life instantly and completely. Dr. Blackwood later testified that she saw blood spray from the wound, saw Whitmore's body jerk from the impact, saw him stumble and nearly fall to his knees in the dust of the main street. Every aspect of the injury appeared consistent with a fatal gunshot wound to the head, the kind of trauma that medical science recognizes as instantly lethal to human life. Yet Sheriff Marcus Whitmore did not fall. Instead, he raised his weapon once more and fired the shot that ended Diego Castellanos' reign of terror, the bullet finding its target with the same deadly precision that had characterized his entire performance in the gunfight. The outlaw leader toppled from his horse, dead before he hit the ground. The remaining gang members, faced with the impossible sight of a man who had absorbed multiple fatal wounds, yet continued fighting with mechanical efficiency, broke ranks and fled in terror. Their horses kicked up clouds of dust as they retreated toward the desert, leaving behind the bodies of their fallen comrades and a mystery that would haunt Perdition Creek forever. Dr. Blackwood rushed from her clinic toward the sheriff, medical bag in hand and emergency procedures running through her trained mind. What she found when she reached him would challenge every principle of medical science she had learned during her years of education and practice. The wounds were real, the damage was severe, yet Marcus Whitmore remained standing and conscious in defiance of all natural law. Dr. Blackwood's first assessment of Sheriff Whitmore's condition revealed injuries that should have resulted in immediate death. The head wound showed clear evidence of bullet penetration, with bone fragments visible and brain tissue exposed. The chest wound had punctured his lung, while the shoulder injury had shattered his collarbone and damaged major blood vessels. Yet he stood before her, conscious and responsive, though his speech seemed distant and mechanical. Her medical training compelled her to attempt treatment despite the apparent impossibility of the situation. She guided Whitmore back to his office, noting that he walked with steady steps despite blood loss that should have rendered him unconscious. His pulse, when she could detect it, seemed irregular and faint, while his breathing appeared shallow and labored, yet he continued to function normally. The psychological impact of witnessing such medical impossibility cannot be understated. Dr. Blackwood had dedicated her life to scientific understanding of human physiology, and what she observed challenged the very foundations of her knowledge. Her training told her that Marcus Whitmore should be dead, yet he sat in his chair, methodically cleaning his weapons as if nothing unusual had occurred. Historical accounts of similar phenomena appear sporadically throughout American folklore, particularly in regions where violent death and extreme stress created conditions that seemed to blur the boundaries between life and death. These stories often involve individuals who continued functioning after sustaining injuries that should have been immediately fatal, their bodies somehow transcending normal biological limitations. Whitmore's responses to Dr. Blackwood's questions became increasingly disturbing as her examination continued. He acknowledged his wounds when asked directly, but showed no pain response when she cleaned and dressed them. His answers came in monotone delivery, factually accurate but lacking the emotional content expected from someone who had just survived an impossible gunfight and sustained multiple fatal injuries. Despite Dr. Blackwood's urgent recommendations that he rest and allow his body to process the trauma, Sheriff Whitmore insisted on continuing his daily duties exactly as he had every day for the past 9 years. His movements remained steady and purposeful, though witnesses noted that his coordination seemed slightly off, as if he were operating his body from a distance rather than inhabiting it naturally. The townspeople who ventured out to witness the aftermath of the gunfight found themselves confronting a mystery that challenged their understanding of life and death. They had clearly seen their sheriff absorb multiple fatal wounds, yet he walked among them, spoke to them, and performed his duties with the same mechanical efficiency that had characterized his entire tenure in office. Word of the impossible gunfight began spreading throughout the territory as witnesses shared their accounts with travelers and traders. The story took on different variations with each telling, but certain core elements remained consistent. Sheriff Marcus Whitmore had been killed in a gunfight, yet continued living and working as if death had simply chosen to ignore him temporarily. Dr. Blackwood made careful notes of every detail, her scientific training compelling her to document what she observed even when it contradicted everything she had been taught about human physiology. Her records from July 15th describe a man who appeared to be dead yet continued functioning, his body somehow sustained by forces that medical science could not identify or explain. As evening approached, the true horror of the situation became apparent to those paying close attention. Sheriff Whitmore showed no signs of healing, no improvement in his condition, yet he continued his duties without complaint or apparent discomfort. The wounds remained as severe as when first inflicted, suggesting that whatever was sustaining him operated outside the normal processes of human biology and recovery. The first night after the gunfight brought new mysteries that deepened the growing sense of supernatural dread hanging over Perdition Creek. Several residents reported seeing Sheriff Whitmore making his usual evening rounds, but his movements seemed different, more mechanical and deliberate than his previous natural grace. Mrs. Patterson observed him from her boarding house window and later told Dr. Blackwood that he moved like a marionette controlled by an invisible puppeteer. Dr. Blackwood attempted to examine the sheriff again that evening, but what she discovered challenged her sanity as much as her medical knowledge. The wounds showed no signs of healing or deterioration, existing in a state of suspended animation that defied every principle of biology she understood. Most disturbing was the absence of normal pain responses, as if his nervous system had simply disconnected from his injuries. The psychological implications of Whitmore's condition began affecting the entire community as word spread through whispered conversations and fearful glances. Some residents wondered if they were witnessing divine intervention, while others suspected darker supernatural forces at work. The rational explanation that their sheriff should be dead yet continued walking among them created a cognitive dissonance that strained everyone's mental equilibrium. American folklore contains numerous accounts of individuals who continued functioning after death, often in frontier communities where violent deaths and extreme circumstances created conditions for such phenomena. These tales typically involve people who died with unfinished business or overwhelming duty that transcended the normal boundaries between life and death, suggesting that intense psychological commitment could override biological limitations. Sheriff Whitmore's own awareness of his condition remained unclear, as his responses to direct questions became increasingly difficult to interpret. He acknowledged his duties, recognized familiar faces, and performed routine tasks with mechanical precision, but deeper questioning revealed a strange emptiness, as if the essential person who had been Marcus Whitmore was no longer fully present in the body that bore his name. July 16th dawned with Sheriff Whitmore beginning his morning routine at exactly 6 o'clock, just as he had every day since taking office in Perdition Creek. However, witnesses who observed him closely noticed subtle but disturbing changes in his appearance and behavior that suggested his condition was evolving in ways that challenged even the supernatural explanation they had begun to accept. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor that Dr. Blackwood recognized as consistent with significant blood loss and circulatory failure. Yet he continued moving with steady purpose, his body somehow functioning despite the absence of normal physiological processes. Most disturbing were his eyes, which several people described as looking through rather than at them during conversations, as if he were seeing something beyond their physical reality. The wounds themselves presented the most medically impossible aspect of his condition. They remained exactly as they had been immediately after the gunfight, neither healing nor deteriorating, existing in a state of suspension that defied every natural law Dr. Blackwood had studied. The head wound particularly troubled her. His brain tissue remained exposed, yet showed no signs of infection or further damage. Historical accounts of similar phenomena often involve individuals who died during moments of extreme stress or overwhelming duty, their consciousness somehow remaining tethered to their physical form through sheer force of will or supernatural intervention. These stories suggest that certain deaths occur gradually, allowing the person to complete essential tasks before finally surrendering to the inevitable transition from life to whatever lies beyond. The townspeople found themselves caught between gratitude for their sheriff's continued protection and growing terror at the impossible nature of his survival. Children began avoiding him entirely, their instinctive responses recognizing something fundamentally wrong about his presence, while adults struggled to maintain normal interactions with a man who should have been buried the previous evening. Dr. Blackwood spent the second day frantically searching through her medical texts and correspondence with Eastern colleagues, seeking any scientific explanation for what she was witnessing. Her training had taught her to approach unusual cases methodically, but Sheriff Whitmore's condition fell so far outside normal medical experience that conventional approaches proved completely inadequate to provide understanding or treatment options. She began documenting every detail of his condition with obsessive precision, measuring his vital signs hourly and noting any changes in his behavior or physical appearance. Her records show a progressive deterioration in his life functions, yet his ability to perform duties remained undiminished, creating a paradox that challenged the fundamental connection between physical health and functional capacity. The psychological impact of studying such an impossible case began affecting Dr. Blackwood's own mental state as her scientific worldview crumbled under the weight of evidence that contradicted everything she believed about life and death. Her journal entries from July 16th reveal growing anxiety about her own sanity and questions about whether she was experiencing some form of shared delusion with the other witnesses. Her correspondence with medical colleagues in Boston and Philadelphia took on increasingly desperate tones as she sought explanations for phenomena that seemed to exist outside the realm of natural science. The responses she received ranged from suggestions of hysteria to recommendations for psychiatric evaluation, none of which addressed the physical reality of what she was observing in Perdition Creek. The isolation of frontier medical practice became particularly acute during crisis situations like this, where unusual cases could not be quickly referred to specialists or major medical centers. Dr. Blackwood found herself completely alone in trying to understand and document events that would challenge the medical establishment's comprehension, knowing that her professional reputation might be destroyed by reporting what she was witnessing. As news of Sheriff Whitmore's impossible survival spread throughout Perdition Creek, the community's initial relief at their protector's continued presence began transforming into a deeper, more primitive fear. Children refused to walk past the jail, while adults found excuses to avoid areas where they might encounter their undead sheriff during his mechanical rounds of the town streets. The local preacher, Reverend Morrison, struggled to provide spiritual guidance for a situation that seemed to exist outside traditional religious understanding. His attempts to visit Sheriff Whitmore resulted in deeply disturbing conversations, where the sheriff responded to questions with technically accurate but emotionally empty answers, as if the essential soul that had animated Marcus Whitmore was no longer fully present in his walking corpse. Business in town began suffering as residents stayed indoors whenever possible, creating an atmosphere of siege that rivaled the fear they had felt before the gang's arrival. The very presence of their impossible sheriff became more terrifying than the threat of outlaw violence, as his condition represented a violation of natural law that challenged their fundamental understanding of reality itself. Dr. Blackwood noted that several residents began experiencing symptoms consistent with extreme anxiety and sleep deprivation, their minds struggling to process the cognitive dissonance created by Whitmore's continued existence. The human psyche, she observed, seemed ill-equipped to handle prolonged exposure to phenomena that contradicted basic assumptions about life and death without suffering significant psychological consequences. The town's isolation became a crucial factor in how the situation developed, as there were no external authorities to consult or higher powers to appeal to for guidance. The residents of Perdition Creek found themselves trapped with their impossible sheriff, unable to flee their duties and responsibilities, but increasingly unable to cope with the supernatural horror that walked among them in familiar human form. The third day, July 17th, brought unmistakable signs that Sheriff Whitmore's impossible condition was beginning to change in ways that deepened the horror of his situation. His movements, while still purposeful, had become more mechanical and less naturally coordinated, as if his consciousness was losing its ability to properly control his damaged physical form with each passing hour. Dr. Blackwood's morning examination revealed that his wounds had begun to show signs of the natural decomposition that death normally brings, yet his cognitive functions remained intact enough for him to continue performing his duties. This combination of mental awareness and physical decay created a grotesque parody of human existence that disturbed even the doctor's scientific detachment from her patient's suffering. His speech patterns had become noticeably different, with longer pauses between words and a mechanical quality that several townspeople found deeply unsettling. When asked direct questions about his condition, Whitmore would acknowledge his awareness of being wounded, but showed no emotional response to the severity of his injuries or the impossibility of his continued function. The psychological horror of the situation intensified as residents realized they were watching a good man's slow dissolution while being unable to help him or understand what forces were keeping him animated. Some began to wonder if his continued existence was a blessing that allowed him to complete his duties, or a curse that prevented his soul from finding the peace that death should bring. Temperature measurements taken by Dr. Blackwood showed that his body had begun cooling toward ambient air temperature, yet he continued to move and speak as if this physical change had no impact on his consciousness. This disconnect between biological reality and functional ability created an uncanny valley effect that made interaction with him increasingly difficult for even his closest acquaintances in the community. On the morning of July 18th, Sheriff Whitmore began what would be his final patrol of Perdition Creek, with the same mechanical precision that had characterized his impossible existence over the previous 3 days. However, witnesses noted that his movements had become increasingly labored, as if the invisible forces sustaining his animation were finally beginning to weaken under the strain of defying natural law. Dr. Blackwood followed him at a distance, her medical curiosity overcoming her growing fear as she documented the final stages of whatever supernatural phenomenon had kept Marcus Whitmore functioning long past his natural death. Her observations revealed a man caught between two states of existence, neither fully alive nor completely dead, struggling to complete duties that had defined his identity for nearly a decade. His interactions with townspeople during this final patrol took on an almost ritualistic quality, as if he were saying goodbye to each person and place that had given meaning to his life as sheriff. Yet his emotional responses remained muted and mechanical, suggesting that whatever remained of Marcus Whitmore's consciousness was focused entirely on completing his final responsibilities to the community he had sworn to protect. The psychological impact on witnesses was profound, as they watched a man they had known and respected for years slowly dissolving before their eyes while maintaining his commitment to duty. Children and adults alike found themselves crying as they watched him struggle through his rounds, their tears a mixture of grief for his suffering and fear of the supernatural forces that had trapped him in this impossible state. Several residents later reported that during his final conversations, Sheriff Whitmore seemed to be trying to communicate something important about his experience, but the mechanical nature of his speech made it difficult to understand whether he was attempting to warn them, reassure them, or simply complete the social rituals that had structured his relationships with the community throughout his years of service. At approximately 2:30 p.m. on July 18th, Sheriff Marcus Whitmore finally stopped walking. Dr. Blackwood, who had been observing from across the street, watched as he simply ceased moving in the middle of his patrol route, standing motionless for several minutes before slowly collapsing to his knees in the dust of Perdition Creek's main street. His impossible 3-day vigil had finally reached its end. The townspeople who witnessed his final moments described a profound sense of release that seemed to emanate from the sheriff's form as whatever supernatural forces had sustained him finally withdrew their support. His face, which had maintained its grayish, mechanical expression for days, suddenly relaxed into something resembling peaceful sleep, suggesting that Marcus Whitmore's consciousness had finally been allowed to depart. Dr. Blackwood's medical examination confirmed what everyone already knew. Sheriff Marcus Whitmore had been Doc Henley's hands trembled as he prepared his most desperate measure, a concoction of laudanum, whiskey, and ground silver that old Mexican healers claimed could break supernatural bonds. The sheriff's condition had deteriorated beyond medical explanation, his body continuing its relentless patrol despite fatal injuries. Blood loss should have killed him twice over, yet something kept him upright, walking those dusty streets with mechanical precision. The physician had witnessed many strange things during his years on the frontier, but nothing compared to this manifestation of Western horror that defied every law of nature he understood. Sheriff Caldwell's eyes had taken on a glassy, distant quality, as if he were seeing something far beyond the physical realm of their small Texas town. His responses to questions became increasingly disconnected from reality. Martha Caldwell sat vigil by the window, watching her husband's ghostly figure patrol the streets below. She had stopped crying hours ago, replaced by a numb acceptance that whatever walked out there bore only passing resemblance to the man she had married 15 years prior. The townspeople whispered of curses and dark magic, but she knew the truth ran deeper than superstition could explain. The silver-laced medicine represented their final hope before accepting that supernatural forces had claimed one of their own. Doc Henley's extensive reading of frontier folklore and indigenous healing practices had led him to this moment. If the stories held any truth, silver could sever the connection between spirit and flesh, finally allowing the sheriff to find peace. As night fell over the settlement, strange lights began appearing in the distance, moving with purpose toward their isolated community. The doctor realized that whatever force animated Sheriff Caldwell might be calling others to join this macabre dance of the undead, transforming their quiet town into a gathering place for restless spirits. The mysterious lights approaching from the horizon sparked panic among the remaining townspeople, who had not yet fled to neighboring settlements. These ethereal flames moved against the wind, defying natural explanation and confirming the supernatural nature of their crisis. Old-timers recalled similar phenomena from Apache legends, describing spirit warriors who refused to cross into the afterlife until their earthly duties were fulfilled. Sheriff Caldwell's deteriorating form showed increasing signs of otherworldly possession, his movements becoming more fluid despite massive physical trauma. The bullet wound that had supposedly killed him had stopped bleeding entirely, the flesh around it taking on an unnatural, waxy appearance. His voice, when he spoke, carried hollow echoes as if emanating from a great distance. Doc Henley loaded his silver-enhanced medicine into a syringe, knowing this represented their community's last chance for salvation. The approaching spirit light suggested that whatever force controlled the sheriff was growing stronger, possibly drawing power from other restless souls scattered across the vast Texas landscape. Time was running short before their isolated town became ground zero for a supernatural gathering. Young Timothy watched from his hiding place as more ghostly figures began materializing on the town's outskirts, drawn by the same force that animated their sheriff. These apparitions bore the appearance of long-dead lawmen, soldiers, and frontiersmen, all sharing the same glassy-eyed expression and mechanical movements that characterized true horror stories from the American frontier. The convergence of these supernatural entities suggested a larger purpose behind Sheriff Caldwell's resurrection, transforming their local tragedy into something far more significant and terrifying. Whatever ancient power had been awakened in their quiet Texas settlement was calling its servants home, preparing for some unknowable mission that would forever change the nature of their small community. Doc Henley approached the sheriff with his silver-laced syringe, knowing that failure meant watching their town become a permanent gathering place for restless spirits. The convergence of ghostly figures had accelerated throughout the night, with dozens of ethereal lawmen now patrolling the streets alongside their undead colleague. Each spirit bore evidence of violent death: gunshot wounds, knife marks, rope burns around their necks. Martha Caldwell insisted on accompanying the doctor, despite the obvious danger of approaching her possessed husband. She carried a silver locket containing their wedding photograph, hoping some remnant of human emotion might still exist within the animated corpse. The sheriff's condition represented more than just supernatural possession. It embodied the violent legacy of frontier justice that had claimed so many lives. The other ghostly figures seemed to recognize Doc Henley's approach, forming a protective circle around Sheriff Caldwell, as if anticipating the threat posed by his silver-enhanced medicine. Their movements displayed tactical coordination that suggested military or law enforcement backgrounds, indicating these spirits had retained their professional instincts even in death. The Dark West had produced countless such figures, men who died violently in service to frontier law. As the doctor prepared to administer his experimental treatment, the sheriff's head turned with unnatural precision, fixing him with eyes that held no trace of human recognition. The voice that emerged carried the weight of multiple personalities, as if all the gathered spirits were speaking through their earthly representative. Their words spoke of unfinished business and eternal duty. The silver-laced medicine represented humanity's ancient understanding of supernatural forces, drawing upon centuries of folklore and indigenous wisdom to combat otherworldly threats. Whether this frontier remedy could overcome such powerful spiritual possession remained to be seen, but it offered their only hope for breaking the growing supernatural convergence before it spread beyond their isolated community. The syringe punctured the sheriff's unnaturally cold flesh with surprising resistance, as if his body had transformed into something harder than human tissue. Immediately, an otherworldly shriek pierced the night air, emerging not from Sheriff Caldwell's throat, but from the collective gathering of ghostly lawmen surrounding them. The silver-laced medicine spread through his system like liquid fire, causing the possessed body to convulse violently. Martha gripped her husband's hand, feeling the unnatural coldness begin to fade as the silver worked its ancient magic against the supernatural forces controlling his corpse. The gathered spirits began to flicker and fade, their connection to the physical realm weakening as their earthly anchor was severed. Doc Henley watched in amazement as his desperate gambit appeared to be working, drawing upon folklore wisdom that predated modern medical understanding. The sheriff's eyes suddenly cleared, showing genuine human consciousness for the first time in 3 days. He looked at his wife with recognition and love, though his voice remained weak and distant. The terrible wounds that had killed him became visible once again, no longer masked by supernatural animation. His body was failing rapidly as natural laws reasserted themselves over otherworldly intervention. "Martha," he whispered, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had seen beyond the veil of death. "I've been walking in two worlds, caught between duty and peace. The others, they've been waiting so long for someone to show them the way." His words revealed the true nature of his supernatural experience, confirming that death had not ended his service, but transformed it. The remaining ghostly figures began dissolving into the night air, finally released from whatever force had bound them to earthly existence. Sheriff Caldwell's sacrifice had somehow provided the key to their spiritual liberation, allowing generations of frontier lawmen to find the peace that had eluded them in life. The convergence was ending, but at a terrible cost. With his remaining strength, Sheriff Caldwell revealed the truth behind his supernatural resurrection and the gathering of ghostly lawmen. He had been chosen by forces beyond human understanding to serve as a beacon for lost spirits, men who had died violently in service to frontier justice and could not find peace. His 3-day walk had been a spiritual journey, visiting locations where these forgotten lawmen had fallen. The sheriff described seeing vast networks of restless spirits scattered across the American frontier, casualties of the violent expansion westward who remained bound to earthly existence by unfinished duties. His own death had somehow opened a gateway between worlds, allowing him to communicate with and ultimately guide these tormented souls toward resolution. The historical horror of frontier violence had created countless such spirits. Martha listened as her husband explained the visions that had driven his posthumous patrol, scenes of corrupt officials, unpunished crimes, and innocent people who had suffered without justice. The ghostly lawmen he had encountered were seeking closure for cases that had remained unsolved for decades, their spiritual energy focused on completing their final earthly responsibilities before moving on to whatever lay beyond. Doc Henley documented every word, recognizing the historical significance of this supernatural testimony. The sheriff's account provided unprecedented insight into frontier folklore and the psychological impact of violent death on the human spirit. These were not mere ghost stories, but genuine accounts of how trauma and duty could transcend physical death, creating lasting connections between the living and deceased. As dawn approached, Sheriff Caldwell's voice grew weaker, but his message remained clear. The American West harbored countless restless spirits seeking justice and peace. His supernatural experience had shown him the vast scope of unresolved spiritual business scattered across the frontier, suggesting that their small Texas town had witnessed only a tiny fraction of a much larger phenomenon affecting the entire Western territories. The sheriff's final hours brought profound revelations about the nature of death and duty on the American frontier. He described encountering the spirits of lawmen who had died in the line of duty across Texas, New Mexico, and beyond, men whose violent deaths had left their souls unable to rest. These ghostly figures had been waiting decades for someone who could bridge the gap between the living and dead worlds. His supernatural journey had taken him to forgotten battlefields, abandoned mining camps, and deserted settlements where frontier justice had been violently administered. Each location held the spiritual imprint of lawmen who had fallen while trying to protect innocent people from the chaos of westward expansion. The Dark West had produced countless such tragedies, creating a hidden population of restless spirits seeking closure. Martha held her husband's hand as he described visions of corrupt politicians, unpunished murderers, and families who had never learned the fate of missing loved ones. The ghostly lawmen he had encountered were bound to earthly existence by their commitment to justice, unable to find peace while knowing that their final cases remained unsolved. Their spiritual energy had been slowly building for generations. The sheriff's resurrection had provided these lost souls with a temporary physical anchor, allowing them to attempt completion of their unfinished business through his animated corpse. However, the silver treatment was severing these supernatural connections, forcing the spirits to accept that earthly justice might remain forever incomplete. Some mysteries were destined to remain unsolved, requiring spiritual acceptance rather than continued struggle. Doc Henley realized they were witnessing a phenomenon that extended far beyond their small community, touching on fundamental questions about death, duty, and the psychological aftermath of frontier violence. The sheriff's experience provided unprecedented insight into American folklore and the lasting spiritual impact of the violent westward expansion that had shaped their nation. As Sheriff Caldwell's supernatural connection weakened, he shared disturbing details about the cost of frontier justice and its impact on the human soul. The ghostly lawmen he had encountered bore not only physical wounds, but deep spiritual trauma from the violence they had witnessed and administered. Many had been forced to make impossible choices between law and mercy, leaving psychological scars that persisted beyond death. His 3-day posthumous patrol had revealed the hidden psychological toll of enforcing law in lawless territories, where survival often required compromising moral principles. The sheriff described meeting spirits of men who had been forced to execute summary justice, participate in vigilante actions, or turn blind eyes to corruption in order to maintain some semblance of order in chaotic frontier communities. These revelations about Western horror extended beyond supernatural elements to encompass the very real trauma experienced by those tasked with maintaining civilization in uncivilized territories. The American frontier had demanded sacrifices from lawmen that left lasting spiritual wounds, creating a hidden population of psychologically damaged souls seeking redemption and understanding rather than traditional justice. Martha wept as her husband confessed his own spiritual burden, the knowledge that his years of service had required him to make decisions that haunted his conscience. The supernatural experience had forced him to confront not only the ghosts of other lawmen, but his own moral compromises and unresolved guilt. Death had not provided escape from these psychological burdens. The gathering of ghostly spirits represented more than supernatural phenomena. It embodied the collective trauma of frontier law enforcement and the psychological price paid by those who attempted to impose order on chaos. Their restless energy stemmed from unresolved guilt, incomplete justice, and the terrible weight of decisions made in impossible circumstances throughout the violent history of westward expansion. With dawn breaking over the Texas plains, Sheriff Caldwell made one final request: to complete his earthly rounds one last time, visiting the homes and businesses he had protected for 15 years. Martha and Doc Henley supported his weakening form as he walked the familiar streets, his supernatural strength fading, but his sense of duty remaining strong until the very end. The townspeople emerged from their hiding places to witness their sheriff's final patrol, many weeping at the sight of a man who had literally given his life in service to their community. His posthumous dedication had become the stuff of legend, transforming a local tragedy into an inspiring tale of supernatural commitment to duty that would be remembered for generations. Each stop on his final round allowed the sheriff to offer words of comfort and guidance to families he had protected, sharing wisdom gained from his unique perspective on life, death, and the responsibilities that bind communities together. His supernatural experience had provided profound insights into the nature of human connection and the lasting impact of selfless service to others. As they approached the jail where his final confrontation had begun, Sheriff Caldwell paused to reflect on the cyclical nature of frontier violence and the price paid by those who stood against chaos. His death had been tragic, but not meaningless, serving as a bridge between the world of the living and the restless spirits seeking peace and justice. The Silver Medicine continued working through his system, gradually severing the supernatural connections that had animated his corpse for 3 impossible days. Doc Henley monitored his patient's vital signs, noting the return of normal biological processes. As otherworldly forces released their hold on his physical form, the boundary between life and death was reasserting itself. Young Timothy would spend the rest of his life documenting the incredible events he had witnessed, ensuring that the story of Sheriff Caldwell's supernatural patrol would survive in American folklore. His detailed account would inspire countless tales of Western horror and frontier justice, contributing to the rich tradition of true horror stories that emerged from the violent expansion westward across the American continent. The 3-day period of supernatural activity had fundamentally changed everyone who witnessed it, providing profound insights into the nature of death, duty, and the spiritual connections that bind communities together. Doc Henley's medical documentation would be studied by researchers interested in paranormal phenomena, while Martha's emotional testimony would preserve the human element of their extraordinary experience for future generations. Word of the sheriff's posthumous patrol spread throughout Texas and beyond, attracting attention from newspaper reporters, folklore collectors, and individuals seeking to understand the supernatural elements that seemed to permeate frontier life. The story became part of the larger tapestry of American ghost stories and historical horror that reflected the psychological impact of westward expansion. The abandoned jail where Sheriff Caldwell had met his fate was eventually demolished, but locals reported continued supernatural activity at the site for decades afterward. Some claimed to see ghostly figures patrolling the area on moonless nights, suggesting that the spiritual energy unleashed during those 3 incredible days had left a permanent imprint on their small Texas community. The legend of the sheriff who shot himself and kept walking became a cornerstone of regional folklore, inspiring cautionary tales about the price of justice and the supernatural forces that might be awakened by violent death. The story served as both entertainment and education, preserving important lessons about frontier life and the psychological toll of maintaining law in lawless territories. Sheriff Caldwell drew his final breath as the sun fully rose over the Texas plains, his supernatural mission finally complete after 3 impossible days of posthumous service. The silver treatment had successfully severed his connection to the other world, allowing both his spirit and those of the ghostly lawmen to find peace. His sacrifice had provided closure for countless restless souls scattered across the American frontier. Martha held her husband's still form as Doc Henley officially pronounced him dead for the 2nd time, noting the peaceful expression that had replaced the haunted look of supernatural possession. The sheriff's face showed the satisfaction of a man who had completed his earthly duties and could finally rest. His 3-day patrol had ended not in tragedy, but in spiritual triumph and community healing. The townspeople gathered to pay their final respects to a man whose dedication had transcended death itself, transforming their understanding of duty, sacrifice, and the supernatural forces that might influence human existence. Sheriff Caldwell's story became a testament to the power of commitment and the mysterious ways in which love for community could overcome even death's finality. Doc Henley's detailed documentation of these events would contribute significantly to the study of frontier psychology and supernatural phenomena, providing future generations with insights into the complex relationship between violence, duty, and spiritual existence. The sheriff's experience offered unprecedented glimpses into the world beyond death and the forces that might bind souls to earthly existence. As years passed, the legend of Sheriff Caldwell's final patrol would inspire countless retellings, becoming an integral part of American folklore and Western horror tradition. The story served as a reminder that true heroism might require sacrifices beyond death itself, and that the bonds of duty and love could transcend any boundary, even that between the living and the dead in the dark West.